A masked stranger steps from the shadows on a dark Minnesota road. 3 boys on bicycles. One simple question that will haunt a family for 27 years. How old are you? 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling answered that question on the night of October 22nd, 1989. Moments later, he vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only tire tracks, footprints, and a community that would never feel safe again. For nearly 3 decades, his mother refused to let the world forget his name. For nearly 3 decades, investigators chased 70,000 leads that went nowhere. And for nearly 3 decades, the man responsible lived freely, his name buried in files that were never properly examined. This is the story of how one family's unimaginable tragedy sparked a revolution in American law, protecting millions of children across the nation. But it's also a story of catastrophic failures, missed opportunities, and a truth that was hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. What makes this case so infuriating is that the monster responsible was never truly missing. His name had been on the police radar from the very first days of the investigation. His shoes matched the prints. His tires matched the tracks. Yet, in a series of baffling oversights, he was brushed aside, allowed to live in freedom for decades while the investigation chased ghosts and ruined the lives of innocent men. Before we begin, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Your support helps us bring these critical stories to light and ensures that cases like Jacob's are never forgotten. Make sure to like this video and leave a comment below with your thoughts. This is Crime Records, and this is the case that changed America forever. St. Joseph, Minnesota in the late 1980s represented everything Americans believed about small-town safety. A community of approximately 2,500 souls nestled in the heartland, where neighbors knew each other by name, where doors remained unlocked after dark, and where the worst crime was usually a speeding ticket on Main Street. The town's police chief embodied this sense of security in the most literal way possible. He didn't even carry a firearm while on duty. That single fact tells you everything you need to know about how safe the residents of St. Joseph felt in their quiet corner of the world. This was a place where danger felt like something that happened somewhere else, to someone else. A place where parents let their children roam freely, where the biggest worry was whether the kids remembered to be home before the streetlights came on. On the rural outskirts of this peaceful community, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon and thick woods that provided shade in summer, lived the Wetterling family. Their home sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where you could hear crickets at night and see every star in the sky. Neighbors were separated by long dirt roads and wide open land, giving each family a sense of privacy and space. It was the kind of place where children could be children, where imagination ran wild in the cornfields, where bikes meant freedom and adventure. Jacob Erwin Wetterling was born on February 17, 1978, the 3rd child of Patty and Jerry Wetterling. He grew up alongside his siblings, his older sister Amy, his younger brother Trevor, and his younger sister Carmen. 4 children in a loving home, living the kind of American childhood that felt timeless and secure. At 11 years old, Jacob embodied everything you'd expect from a Minnesota kid growing up in the heartland. He loved hockey, the state's unofficial religion, skating on frozen ponds, with the same enthusiasm as thousands of other kids across the state. He loved basketball, spending hours shooting hoops in the driveway, perfecting his free throws and dreaming of game-winning shots. But more than anything else in the world, Jacob loved watching football on television with his father. Those moments on the couch, father and son, watching the Minnesota Vikings battle it out on the gridiron. Those were Jacob's favorite times, the simple pleasure of shared experience, the bond between a boy and his dad over something as ordinary as a football game. Jerry would explain the plays, and Jacob would ask questions, soaking up every moment of time with his father. Jacob had simple, clear preferences that defined who he was. His favorite food was steak, cooked just right. His favorite color was blue, the color of clear Minnesota skies. And his absolute favorite pastime, the thing that brought him the most joy, was settling in to watch a game on television, preferably with his dad beside him, a bowl of popcorn between them, and the Vikings hopefully winning. He was known among family, friends, and teachers as a gentle soul, sweet-natured, kind, the type of boy who wouldn't hurt a fly, the type of son every parent hopes to raise. His teachers described him as polite and attentive. His friends knew him as loyal and fun-loving. His family cherished him as a loving, thoughtful child who brought joy to their home every single day. Sunday, October 22nd, 1989 began as the perfect autumn day. The kind of day that stays in your memory forever, not because of what happened during the daylight hours, but because of what came after darkness fell. The weather was beautiful, crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that only comes in autumn, when the sun seems to glow golden through the changing leaves. Jacob woke early that morning, filled with anticipation. He and his father Jerry had plans to go fishing, one of Jacob's absolute favorite activities. There's something special about fishing with your dad when you're 11 years old. The quiet conversations as you cast your lines, the patient waiting, watching the water for any sign of a bite. The shared hope that this cast might be the one that brings in the big catch. The sandwiches shared on the boat or the riverbank. The feeling that time has slowed down and the world consists of just you, your dad, and the water. They returned home from their fishing expedition just in time to settle in for the main event of the day, the Minnesota Vikings matchup against the Detroit Lions. Jacob and Jerry claimed their spots on the couch, ready for an afternoon of football. For Jacob, this was paradise. His favorite activity with his favorite person, watching his favorite team. The Vikings were playing at home and Jacob hoped desperately they would win. That afternoon, after the game concluded, the entire Wetterling family went indoor ice skating together. Patty, Jerry, Amy, Trevor, Carmen and Jacob all gliding across the ice, laughing, holding hands, helping the younger ones stay upright, spending time together as a family. It was wholesome. It was normal. It was exactly the kind of Sunday that defines a happy childhood in small-town America. The day was filled with everything Jacob loved most. Fishing with Dad, football with Dad, ice skating with the whole family. There was no sign, no warning, no premonition of the nightmare that was about to unfold. No dark clouds on the horizon, no sense of foreboding, no indication that this perfect day would be the last normal day the Wetterling family would ever know. As evening approached and the autumn sun began to sink toward the horizon, Patty and Jerry prepared for dinner plans with friends. The gathering was located about 25 miles away, roughly 32 kilometers, a drive that would take approximately 25 minutes through the rural Minnesota countryside. They expected to return home at a reasonable hour. It wasn't going to be a late night. They'd have dinner, spend some time with their friends, and be back before the children's bedtime. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, as the sun was setting and the sky was beginning to darken, Patty and Jerry departed for their dinner engagement. Since there was no school the following day, Monday being a teacher in-service day when students had the day off, They felt comfortable leaving their older children at home for the evening. This was St. Joseph, after all. The safest place in the world. Nothing bad ever happened here. Amy, the eldest of the Wetterling children, was spending the night at a friend's house, as teenage girls often do on Sunday evenings. That left 8-year-old Carmen, 10-year-old Trevor, and 11-year-old Jacob at the residence. Jacob's friend, 11-year-old Aaron Larson, was also there, staying over for what should have been an ordinary fun sleepover filled with pizza, video games, and the rented movie they planned to watch. As the three boys, Trevor, Jacob, and Aaron, shared a pizza that evening, enjoying their freedom and the prospect of a fun night ahead, they came up with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan. They wanted to rent a movie from the local Tom Thumb convenience store, located about a 15-minute bike ride from the Wetterling home. It was the kind of thing kids did all the time in St. Joseph. A quick trip into town, pick out a movie from the rental section, maybe grab some candy or snacks, pedal back home and spend the evening watching it and laughing together. The boys called their mother at the dinner party to ask for permission to make the trip. They were being responsible, asking for approval before heading out into the darkness. Patty's response was immediate and unequivocal. Absolutely not. In her mother's intuition, something about the idea didn't sit right. It was dark outside. The roads between the house and town were rural, poorly lit, isolated. She could picture them pedaling along those dark roads, and she didn't like it. She said no, firmly, and she meant it. The answer was no, but 10-year-old Trevor wasn't ready to accept that answer. He did what countless children have done throughout history when one parent says no. He asked to speak with the other parent, hoping for a different outcome, hoping that Dad might be more lenient, might see things differently. Jerry Wetterling listened to his son's request. He weighed the considerations carefully. Yes, it was dark outside, but the store was only 15 minutes away by bike. The boys would be together, 3 of them, safety in numbers. They were responsible kids who knew the route well. And besides, this was St. Joseph. Nothing bad ever happened in St. Joseph. Crime was virtually non-existent. The biggest dangers on those roads were deer crossing and the occasional pothole. Jerry made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He overruled his wife's refusal and told the boys they could go. But Jerry was a responsible father who took his children's safety seriously. He set specific conditions intended to ensure the boys' safety on their nighttime journey. They had to take a flashlight with them so they could see the road ahead and so that any approaching vehicles could see them coming from a distance. And they had to wear reflective vests, bright and visible, the kind that construction workers and crossing guards wear, so that any passing motorists would be able to spot them clearly in the darkness, even from far away. These precautions seemed reasonable, sensible, the kind of safety measures that would protect his children while allowing them a small measure of independence and adventure. It was a father's attempt to balance caution with freedom, to let his boys enjoy a small adventure while taking steps to keep them safe. That decision, made with the best of intentions, born of a desire to let his children experience normal childhood independence, would become one of the most agonizing memories Jerry Wetterling would carry for the rest of his life. He would replay that phone conversation thousands of times, wondering what would have happened if he had simply said no. If he had backed up his wife's instinct, if he had told the boys to stay home. Not wanting to leave 8-year-old Carmen home alone while the boys were out on their errand, they contacted their 14-year-old neighbor, Rochelle Jerzak, who lived just next door. She agreed to come over to the Wetterling house and stay with Carmen while the boys made their trip to the store. It seemed like a perfect solution. Carmen would be supervised and safe, and the boys could have their adventure. Jacob gathered the necessary items his father had required. He secured a flashlight, making sure it had fresh batteries, and tested it to ensure it had a strong, bright beam. He put on the reflective vest, adjusting it over his red jacket, the jacket with the metal buttons and the police department emblem that his parents had gotten for him. Then the three boys, Jacob Wetterling, Trevor Wetterling, and Aaron Larson, climbed onto their bicycles and set out into the night, pedaling toward the Tom Thumb convenience store, excited about picking out a movie and looking forward to the rest of their evening. The route between the Wetterling home and the Tom Thumb was familiar to all of them. They'd ridden these roads countless times during daylight hours, knew every curve and hill, every landmark along the way. But at night, the landscape transformed into something different, something less familiar. The wide open spaces that felt friendly and inviting in sunshine became vast and dark and slightly menacing. The cornfields that rustled peacefully in the day seemed to whisper with hidden movements in the night, stalks swaying in ways that could be the wind or could be something else. As the boys pedaled along the rural road, toward town, their bicycle wheels humming against the pavement, they heard rustling sounds coming from the cornfields lining their path. Strange sounds in the darkness, movement in the long grass and stalks of corn, sounds that made them pause and look toward the fields. The boys slowed for a moment, listening, trying to determine what was making the noise, but they quickly dismissed it as nothing to worry about. It was probably just an animal. Maybe a deer moving through the fields as deer often did in this area, or perhaps just the wind pushing through the corn, making the dried stalks rattle against each other. Nothing to worry about. Nothing unusual for a rural Minnesota night. They continued their ride, putting the strange sounds out of their minds. The beam of Jacob's flashlight cut through the darkness ahead of them, illuminating the road and creating a small bubble of light in which they travelled. Their reflective vests glowed whenever a car's headlights swept over them, which wasn't often on these quiet roads. Most of the time they had the road entirely to themselves. Three boys on bikes in the darkness, the only sounds their breathing and the whir of their wheels and the distant rustle of corn. The boys arrived at the Tom Thumb without incident. They parked their bikes outside, the fluorescent lights of the store seeming almost blindingly bright after the darkness of the ride. They went inside, enjoyed the warmth and brightness, and browsed the selection of videos available for rent. After some discussion and debate about what they wanted to watch, they made their choice. The Naked Gun, a comedy starring Leslie Nielsen that promised laughs and entertainment for their evening. After paying for the rental and perhaps grabbing a few snacks, they completed their transaction and began the return trip home, excited to get back and start the movie. They had no idea someone had been watching them, waiting for them, planning what would happen next. The sky was profoundly dark as the three boys began the 15-minute journey back to the cul-de-sac. The kind of darkness you only find in rural areas, far from the light pollution of cities, where the night sky is a vast black expanse dotted with countless stars. As they pedaled away from the Tom Thumb, the familiar lights of the store began to fade behind them, growing dimmer with each rotation of their bicycle wheels, the warm glow shrinking in the distance, eventually vanishing altogether into the darkness that surrounded them on all sides. They entered a rural stretch where no streetlights guided their path. Out here on the edges of St. Joseph, civilization gave way to farmland and forest. The pavement gave way to the occasional gravel drive. Houses became fewer and farther between. The only illumination cutting through the void was the single flashlight Jacob carried, its beam bouncing slightly with each pedal stroke, casting strange, dancing shadows on the road ahead of them. The boys were roughly 2 to 3 minutes away from the safety of the Wetterling house. So close, almost home. They could practically see it in their minds, could imagine walking through the door, popping the movie into the VCR, settling in for an evening of entertainment. They were approaching a long gravel driveway that led to a farm at the end of the road, the Rassier property, when something happened that would change their lives forever. A figure suddenly emerged from the shadows beside the road and walked directly toward them, stepping out so quickly and unexpectedly that the boys barely had time to react. A man dressed entirely in black, black pants, black jacket, and a black mask covering his face, hiding his identity in the darkness, making him look like something from a nightmare. The man spoke, his voice cutting through the night air like a knife. He announced that he had a gun and commanded the boys to stop immediately. His voice was raspy, rough, threatening. There was no room for argument in that voice. No hint that this might be a joke or a prank. Shock and confusion washed over the 3 boys like a wave of ice water. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in St. Joseph. This had to be some kind of joke. Maybe older kids from school trying to scare them, taking a prank way too far, a Halloween joke a few weeks early. It had to be something like that. The man repeated his command, more forcefully this time, his voice rising in volume and intensity. Stop. Now. Do what I say. The boys stopped, their bicycles coming to a halt on the dark road, their hearts beginning to pound in their chests as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The man issued his next order, his raspy voice leaving no room for disobedience. He told them to throw their bicycles into the ditch beside the road. Get rid of them. Now! The boys hesitated for just a moment, looking at each other in the darkness, unsure what to do, hoping this was still somehow a joke that would end any second. But the man's threatening posture made it clear this was no joke. They complied, lifting their bikes and tossing them into the ditch, where they clattered and crashed into the tall grass and weeds. Then came the command that sent ice through their veins, that made their blood run cold, that told them this was real and serious and terrifying. The man ordered the boys themselves to get into the ditch and lie face down on the ground. Get down there, face down. Don't look at me. As the boys climbed down into the ditch and lowered themselves to the cold earth, their hands touching the damp grass and dirt, Trevor and Aaron still clung to the fragile hope that this was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe teenagers from the high school, maybe someone's older brother playing a mean, cruel joke that had gone way too far. Any second now, someone would laugh and tell them it was all fake and they could go home. That fragile illusion shattered completely. When the man began to speak again, his voice was chilling, raspy, rough. There was something deeply wrong about the sound of it, something that told them this was no prank, no joke, no game. This was real. This was actually happening. This was dangerous. The man approached Trevor first, his footsteps crunching in the gravel and dirt. He stood over the 10-year-old boy and asked a simple question, a question that seemed absurdly normal given the circumstances. How old are you? Trevor, his voice trembling with fear, barely able to get the words out, answered truthfully. 10. The man processed this information for a moment, standing there in the darkness considering. Then he gave Trevor a command that the boy would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, would hear in his nightmares for decades to come. He told Trevor to get up, to run into the bushes and woods as fast as he possibly could, and he issued a warning, delivered in that terrible raspy voice that Trevor would never forget. Don't look back. If you look back, I'll shoot you. Run, and don't you dare turn around. Trevor didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking, and ran. He ran into the darkness of the woods, his legs pumping, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest, crashing through bushes and undergrowth and low-hanging branches. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, faster than he'd run in any race or game, terror giving him speed he didn't know he possessed. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached and he couldn't run anymore. Once Trevor had fled into the darkness and the sound of his running footsteps had faded into the distance, the man turned his attention to the two boys who remained. Jacob and Aaron, both still lying in the ditch, both terrified beyond anything they'd ever experienced, beyond anything they'd imagined in their worst nightmares. The man ordered them both to stand up. Get up, both of you. Now. They obeyed, rising slowly to their feet on trembling legs, uncertain what was coming next, praying that they would be told to run like Trevor had been. But what happened next was something no child should ever experience. As the man held them there in the darkness, as they stood shaking and terrified, he began touching Jacob inappropriately. His hands moved over the boy's body in a way that made Jacob's skin crawl, violating him, groping him, crossing boundaries that should never be crossed, while Aaron stood frozen nearby, horrified and helpless, not knowing what to do, too terrified to move or speak. While this violation was taking place, while Jacob stood there enduring this nightmare, the man continued his interrogation, asking questions in that raspy voice. He asked Aaron his age, the same question he'd asked Trevor. Aaron's voice was barely a whisper, choked with fear. 11. Then the man asked Jacob the same question, his hands still on the boy. How old are you? Jacob, trying to keep his voice steady despite his fear, despite what was happening to him, answered, 11. The man seemed to consider this information, seemed to be making some kind of decision in his mind. Then he issued the same command to Aaron that he had given to Trevor minutes earlier. Run into the woods as fast as you can. Don't look back or I'll shoot you. Run. Now. Aaron didn't hesitate. He bolted into the darkness, his feet pounding against the ground, his arms pumping, branches scratching at his face and arms as he crashed through the underbrush. He ran with such frantic speed, such desperate terror driving him forward, that he eventually caught up with Trevor, who had been hiding in the woods, waiting, hoping, not knowing what to do next. The two boys found each other in the darkness, recognizing each other's shapes and voices. They held onto each other, breathing hard, their hearts racing, their whole bodies shaking with fear and adrenaline. They stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Should they keep running deeper into the woods? Should they try to go back to the road? Where was Jacob? What was happening to Jacob? The impulse to look back became overwhelming. Despite the man's warning, despite the threat that they would be shot if they turned around, despite their terror, they had to know what had happened to their friend. They couldn't just leave him there. They had to see. Slowly, carefully, trying to stay hidden behind trees and bushes, Trevor and Aaron turned their heads to look back toward the road where they'd left Jacob. What they saw made their blood run cold, made their hearts nearly stop in their chests. Nothing. Both Jacob and the masked man had completely vanished. There was no sign of a struggle, no sound of a vehicle starting or driving away, no indication of where they had gone or in what direction they might have travelled. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed them both whole, as if they had never been there at all. The road was empty. The night was silent except for the wind in the corn and the distant sound of crickets. Jacob was gone. It was approximately 9:20 in the evening, 9:20 post-meridium on Sunday, October 22nd, 1989. The exact moment that would be seared into the memories of everyone involved, the moment that would be analysed and discussed and wondered about for decades to come. The last time anyone would see Jacob Wetterling alive. Trevor and Aaron made a decision. They had to get help. They had to tell someone what had happened. They ran. They ran toward the Wetterling house as fast as their legs would carry them, stumbling in the darkness, falling and getting back up, fear giving them speed they didn't know they had. They reached the house in what felt like both an eternity and an instant, in a state of absolute terror, screaming, crying, barely able to form coherent words. Rochelle Jerzak, who had been watching Carmen, watching television and, assuming everything was fine, heard the boys' screams and rushed to see what was wrong. She opened the door to find Trevor and Aaron on the doorstep, hysterical, their words tumbling over each other in panic. Someone had taken Jacob, a man with a mask, a gun. Jacob was gone, just gone. He was there and then he wasn't, and they didn't know where he went or what happened to him. Rochelle was 14 years old, overwhelmed, and had no idea how to handle a crisis of this magnitude. She'd been asked to babysit an 8-year-old girl for a few hours, not to deal with an abduction and missing child and hysterical boys. She did the only thing she could think of. She ran next door to find her father, Merle Jerzak, knowing he would know what to do, knowing adults would be able to handle this. Merle Jerzak immediately grasped the urgency and severity of the situation. His first action was to call Patty and Jerry Wetterling at the dinner party. When Jerry answered the phone, probably expecting a simple question about bedtime or what the kids could have for a snack, Merle's message was direct and terrifying. "You need to come home right now. Something's happened to Jacob. A stranger has taken him." The words every parent dreads hearing, the nightmare that every mother and father fears. Your child is missing. Your child has been taken. Come home. Now. After hanging up with the Wetterlings, after delivering news that would shatter their world, Merle immediately dialed 911, his fingers shaking as he punched in the numbers. Because he had not been a witness to the abduction himself, and because the boys were so upset they could barely speak clearly, their words coming out in gasps and sobs, Merle struggled to convey the specifics of what had happened to the emergency dispatcher. The dispatcher needed details, concrete information. What exactly happened? Where did it happen? When? Who was involved? Merle did his best to relay the information he was getting from the traumatized boys, but eventually he made the decision to put Trevor on the phone directly so the boy could explain what he had witnessed firsthand. Trevor, still crying, still terrified, still shaking from what he'd experienced, did his best to describe what had happened. He told the dispatcher about a man with a raspy voice who was short and stocky in build. A man wearing all black with a mask over his face. A man who had a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. A man who had taken his brother. The emergency call was recorded, capturing the frantic atmosphere as neighbors and the boys tried to provide descriptions that might help law enforcement. The dispatcher asked careful questions, trying to build a picture of what had occurred, trying to gather information that would help officers respond appropriately. Jacob had been wearing a red jacket with metal buttons and a police department emblem on it. He'd been wearing the reflective vest his father had insisted upon. He'd been carrying the flashlight they'd taken with them. All of these details were relayed to the dispatcher, painted a picture of what the missing boy looked like, what he was wearing, what items he had with him. The dispatcher questioned whether they had seen a vehicle, any kind of car or truck that might help identify the perpetrator or the direction he might have travelled. But the boys could only report what they had witnessed. The man had appeared on foot on the road. They hadn't seen any vehicle. They hadn't heard any engine starting or tyres on gravel. The man and Jacob had simply disappeared into the darkness as if they'd never been there. When the first police officers arrived at the Wetterling home, responding to what should have been treated as the most urgent call possible, what happened next would become one of the most criticised aspects of the entire investigation. Rather than immediately launching a full-scale pursuit, rather than flooding the area with officers and setting up roadblocks and organising searches, the responding officers spent the most crucial minutes of the disappearance doing something that wasted precious, irreplaceable time. They questioned Trevor and Aaron with a high degree of scepticism. The officers did not initially believe the boys' account of an abduction. Instead of accepting that a child had been kidnapped and acting accordingly, instead of treating this as the emergency it was, they entertained alternative theories. Perhaps the boys had been playing with a firearm and accidentally shot Jacob, and now they were making up a story to cover up what had really happened. Or perhaps Jacob had simply run away from home for some reason, maybe after a fight with his brothers or his friend, and his friends were providing a cover story to give him a head start before anyone came looking for him. These theories, born of disbelief that such a crime could occur in St. Joseph, born of the conviction that nothing bad ever happened in their peaceful town, cost the investigation dearly. It was not until 10:45 that evening, nearly 90 minutes after the abduction had occurred, that a formal, organised search was finally initiated. 90 minutes, an hour and a half. In an abduction case, particularly involving a child, the first minutes and hours are absolutely critical. The perpetrator could have travelled dozens of miles in any direction. The window of opportunity to catch someone in the immediate area, to set up roadblocks that might intercept them, shrinks with every passing second. By the time law enforcement finally mobilized their full resources, that window had significantly narrowed. The golden hour, as it's called in law enforcement. The crucial period immediately following a crime when evidence is freshest and suspects are closest, had long since passed. Eventually, the authorities did mobilize a sizable force. Firefighters were called in from multiple departments. Volunteers from the community, people who had heard the news and wanted to help, poured out of their homes ready to search. Helicopters took to the air, their searchlights sweeping across fields and forests, looking for any sign of a boy or a man or anything out of place. Despite the scale of the effort, despite dozens of people searching through the night, combing through cornfields and woods and ditches, the searchers found only 2 physical clues near the gravel driveway where the abduction had taken place. A set of footprints in the soft earth beside the road, preserved in the damp ground, and tyre tracks suggesting a vehicle had been present at some point, though whether before, during or after the abduction remained unclear. These were the only physical evidence left behind. Everything else had vanished with Jacob into the darkness. In the haste and confusion of that chaotic night, the officers made another critical error that would haunt the investigation for years. They failed to canvass the immediate neighbours for information. They didn't go door to door asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. They didn't systematically question the people who lived closest to where the crime had occurred, the people who might have witnessed something important. Most significantly, they didn't even seek out or question Dan Rassier, an elementary school music teacher who lived at the very end of that long gravel driveway where Jacob had been taken. Dan's house was right there, at the scene of the crime, and yet no officer thought to knock on his door and ask if he'd witnessed anything that evening, if he'd seen any vehicles or strangers or anything out of the ordinary. This oversight would prove significant because Dan Rassier had in fact seen something unusual earlier that night, something that might have been relevant to the investigation. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, approximately 20 minutes before Jacob was abducted, Dan had been home alone when he heard his dog, Smokey, barking persistently outside. Dan got up from what he was doing and looked out the window to see what was agitating his dog, what was causing all the commotion. He saw headlights moving down his driveway, a vehicle approaching his house through the darkness. Dan watched as the vehicle came down the long gravel drive, then performed a turn in his yard and headed back out toward the main road, leaving his property the way it had come. Dan thought this was odd, but not particularly alarming. Maybe someone had gotten lost and was using his driveway to turn around. Maybe someone had taken a wrong turn and realized their mistake. It happened sometimes in rural areas where driveways were long and houses were set back from the road. He dismissed the incident as nothing important and went back to bed. Later that night, Dan was woken again by Smokey's barking, even more insistent this time, more agitated than before. He got up again and looked out his window, wondering what could be bothering the dog now. This time he saw something different, something more concerning. Several men with flashlights were moving around his property, near his woodpile, shining lights into corners and examining the ground. Dan's first thought was that people were trying to steal his firewood. It had happened before in rural areas, people helping themselves to wood that didn't belong to them. He prepared to go outside and confront them, to tell them to get off his property, but as he looked more carefully, he saw there were quite a few people out there, too many to confront safely. This wasn't a couple of opportunistic thieves. This was something else. Instead of confronting them, Dan decided to call 911 and report what he believed was an attempted theft in progress, multiple trespassers on his property. The dispatcher who answered his call quickly informed him that the men on his property were police officers conducting a search for a missing child. They were searching the area around his farm, using flashlights to examine every possible hiding place or clue, looking for any sign of the boy or the person who had taken him. Dan went outside to offer his assistance, wanting to be helpful, wanting to do whatever he could. He suggested to the officers that they should look around his farm buildings, his barn, his outbuildings, other properties in the area where someone might hide. He tried to be cooperative, tried to provide useful information about the area. But despite this interaction, despite Dan being right there, willing to talk, eager to help, the officers never took the opportunity to formally question him about what he had seen earlier in the evening. They never asked about the vehicle in his driveway around 9 o'clock. They never took a detailed statement about the headlights and the car that had turned around. They were focused on the physical search, on looking for Jacob, and the opportunity to gather potentially crucial information slipped away in the chaos of the night. By the following morning, Monday, October 23rd, the news of the abduction had rippled through the community of St. Joseph like a shockwave, spreading from house to house, from phone call to phone call. The town transformed overnight as residents mobilized to help find Jacob. people who had never met the Wetterlings, who only knew them as names in the community, showed up ready to search, ready to do anything they could to bring the boy home. The media coverage grew exponentially, spreading from local news stations to regional broadcasts to national attention. The disappearance of Jacob Wetterling was becoming a story of national interest, capturing the attention and breaking the hearts of people across the entire country. News vans arrived, reporters set up cameras. The quiet cul-de-sac became a hub of activity. The Wetterling home became a center of constant, frantic activity. Hundreds of officers from various jurisdictions descended on the property, establishing it as a command center for the investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation sent agents. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension deployed investigators. Local law enforcement from multiple counties coordinated their efforts. Phone lines were set up. Maps were spread across tables. Strategies were discussed and implemented. In the week immediately following Jacob's disappearance, the search efforts reached a truly staggering scale. Thousands of volunteers answered the call to help. They formed human chains that stretched down the main roads, walking in coordinated lines, shoulder to shoulder, eyes scanning every inch of ground for any sign of Jacob or any clue about what had happened to him. People took time off work. Schools dismissed early so students could join the search. Businesses closed so employees could help. Law enforcement deployed every resource at their disposal. Bloodhounds were brought in, their sensitive noses trained to pick up Jacob's scent, from clothing provided by his family, and follow it wherever it might lead. Helicopters circled overhead, their crews scanning the landscape from above, looking for any anomaly in the terrain. All-terrain vehicles roared through fields and forests, covering ground that couldn't be reached on foot or by car. Some officers even searched on horseback, able to navigate rough terrain and see over tall grass and brush. Despite this massive mobilization, despite the thousands of hours logged by dedicated searchers, despite the deployment of cutting-edge technology and old-fashioned determination, no trace of Jacob was found. It was as if he had simply evaporated into thin air, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him. Patty and Jerry Wetterling committed themselves completely to keeping Jacob's name in the public consciousness. They understood that media attention was crucial, that the moment the public stopped thinking about Jacob, the moment the news moved on to other stories, the case would fade from priority. So they participated in media interviews almost every single day, putting their grief on display for the cameras, pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. In one particularly heartbreaking interview with the St. Cloud Times newspaper, Jerry Wetterling spoke with raw, unfiltered emotion and remorse that would stay with everyone who heard his words. "I'll carry this for the rest of my life. I'm the one who made the choice that night, and my son never came home. If anyone has any information about Jacob, please come forward. I would give anything, pay any price, just to bring my son home." The weight of that decision, the moment when Jerry overruled Patty's initial refusal and gave the boys permission to ride to the store, crushed him. Every parent makes dozens of decisions every day about what their children can and cannot do. Almost all of those decisions turn out fine. But this one, this single decision, had resulted in catastrophe. Over the years, the investigation would amass approximately 70,000 leads, 70,000 separate tips, sightings, theories, and pieces of information, each of which had to be documented, evaluated, and followed up by investigators. Every year on Jacob's birthday, February 17th, Patty and Jerry established a heartbreaking ritual. They would light a candle on a cupcake in his honor, holding on to hope that someday he would return to blow it out. They also kept a porch light burning every night, a beacon to guide Jacob home. Before we continue with this investigation, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Your engagement helps us bring more cases like this to light. During the annual prayer service on October 22nd, 1994, exactly 5 years after Jacob vanished, something happened that would redirect the investigation in an unexpected and controversial direction. A woman named Evangeline attended the gathering at St. Joseph Catholic Church. She was a former high school friend of Patty Wetterling's, someone Patty hadn't seen or spoken to in many years. The two women had lost contact after graduation, their lives moving in different directions, as often happens with childhood friends who end up in different towns, different careers, different worlds. Evangeline had recognized Patty's name because Jacob's case had appeared so frequently in newspapers over the past 5 years. The story had been impossible to miss, dominating local news coverage, appearing regularly in regional papers. For that specific reason, Evangeline had deliberately travelled from Little Falls to St. Joseph and attended the prayer service with the express hope of reconnecting with her old friend, of offering support, of being there for Patty in this ongoing nightmare. The atmosphere inside St. Joseph Catholic Church was heavy, almost oppressive, with the collective grief of a community that had been waiting 5 long years for answers that never came. Parishioners filled the pews, many of them having attended this same service for 5 consecutive years, coming together annually to remember Jacob and to support the Wetterling family in their ongoing nightmare. Candles flickered, hymns were sung, prayers were offered. Hope was expressed that this year might finally bring resolution. During the prayer service, as hymns were sung and prayers were offered for Jacob's safe return, Evangeline happened to look toward the altar and saw something that gave her pause. The man presiding over the ceremony, serving as the associate priest leading portions of the liturgy, was someone she recognized. His name was Father Damien Barker. Evangeline watched him closely as he moved through the ritual, her recognition of him growing more certain with every passing minute. She knew this man. She knew him from Little Falls, the town where she lived, the town where he had previously served as a priest before coming to St. Joseph. Shortly after the service ended and the parishioners began to disperse into the cool October evening, Evangeline found Patty in the crowd outside the church. The two old friends embraced, their reunion emotional after so many years apart. So much time had passed. So much had happened to Patty since they'd last seen each other. The weight of 5 years of searching showed on Patty's face. After the initial reconnection, after the exchange of basic pleasantries and catching up on each other's families, Evangeline asked Patty a pointed question. Did Patty know anything about the background of Father Damien Barker? Did she know where he had come from before arriving at St. Joseph Catholic Church? Patty thought about it for a moment, trying to recall details. She explained that Father Barker had been transferred to St. Joseph Catholic Church a few years earlier, though as she searched her memory, she admitted she could not remember the exact date of his arrival. She confessed that she knew very little about his life or his previous assignments before he joined their parish. He was simply their associate priest, someone who served the community, someone who had been part of Jacob's memorial services year after year. What Evangeline shared next left Patty visibly shaken, her face going pale as the implications began to sink in. Evangeline explained that before his transfer to St. Joseph, Father Damien Barker had been a newly ordained priest serving at St. Francis Church in Little Falls. According to Evangeline, who still lived there and remembered the incident well, Father Barker had been involved in a very serious incident at St. Francis, an incident serious enough that it resulted in him being quietly removed from his position and reassigned to another parish without any public explanation. The parishioners at St. Francis Church were kept completely in the dark about the details of his departure. They were never told what had happened. They were never told where Father Barker had been sent. One day he was their priest, leading masses and working with the youth group, and the next day he was simply gone, replaced by someone else with no explanation offered by the diocese. The incident Evangeline was referring to involved allegations of inappropriate sexual contact with a 13-year-old male parishioner. At the time the allegations surfaced, the boy's family had been devastated and outraged. They had reported the matter to both the local police authorities and to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, following what they believed were the proper channels for such serious accusations. Yet, somehow, mysteriously, the situation had simply faded away, without any public explanation or resolution. The victim's family stopped talking about it, whether because they were paid off or simply exhausted from fighting the Church's institutional power. Other members of the St. Francis parish stopped asking questions, discouraged from pursuing the matter. And Father Damien Barker was quietly, efficiently removed from Little Falls and reassigned to a new parish in St. Joseph, where no one knew about the allegations against him, where he could start fresh with a clean slate. Evangeline told Patty that persistent rumours had circulated throughout Little Falls, suggesting that Father Barker was the nephew of a high-ranking official within the Diocese of St. Cloud. According to these rumours, widely believed, if impossible to confirm, the case had been quietly settled behind closed doors, handled internally by the Church, covered up to avoid a public scandal that would embarrass the diocese and damage the reputation of the Catholic Church in the region. Following this disturbing conversation, Patty Wetterling's mind was racing with possibilities and implications. She began to research and look into the specific timing of Father Barker's arrival at St. Joseph Catholic Church. What she discovered made her stomach turn and her heart race. Father Damien Barker had been assigned to St. Joseph Catholic Church in April of 1989, just 6 months before Jacob went missing in October of that same year. 6 months. A priest with credible allegations of sexual abuse involving a young boy, quietly transferred to St. Joseph to escape scandal and public scrutiny, arriving just 6 months before an 11-year-old boy was abducted from the very community that priest now served. The timing was impossible to ignore. Overwhelmed by the implications of this timing, feeling that this could not possibly be mere coincidence, Patty immediately shared everything she had learned with Jerry. This information was too important, too potentially significant to keep to herself even for a moment. Jerry Wetterling wasted no time. He promptly took the information directly to the local police, hoping desperately that it would spark a new direction in an investigation that had been spinning its wheels for 5 years with no real progress, no viable suspects, no breaks in the case. However, the response Jerry received was deeply disappointing and frustrating. Police Chief Robert Hargrove dismissed the suggestion outright, barely giving it serious consideration. He told Jerry that the suspicion was unfounded and based entirely on hearsay and rumour. He stated firmly that he could not and would not authorise an investigation into a member of the clergy based on such claims. There was no evidence, Chief Hargrove argued, just rumours from another town and coincidental timing. That wasn't enough to open an investigation into a priest, especially not one as respected and well-liked as Father Barker. The reality of the situation in the mid-1990s must be understood in its proper historical context. The Catholic Church and its priests still held immense social and moral influence within American communities, particularly in small, heavily Catholic towns like St. Joseph, Minnesota. The church was a pillar of the community, the center of social and spiritual life for many families. Priests were seen as moral authorities, trusted implicitly by their congregations, respected without question by the broader community. To suspect a priest of such a heinous crime, to even suggest that a man of the cloth could be capable of abducting and harming a child, was considered socially unacceptable by many, almost blasphemous. Law enforcement officials, many of whom were themselves Catholic and attended the very churches these priests served, were conditioned through culture and training to tread with extreme caution when dealing with any accusations involving the church or its clergy. The institutional power and influence of the Catholic Church in that era cannot be overstated. This was before the widespread exposure of clergy abuse scandals in the early 2000s, before the Boston Globe's Spotlight investigation broke the story wide open, before the public became fully aware of how the Church had systematically protected abusive priests for decades by moving them from parish to parish. In 1994, suggesting that a priest could be a predator was still shocking to many people, still almost unthinkable for those who had been raised to revere and trust clergy without question. So the matter remained stagnant, filed away and forgotten. Father Damien Barker continued to serve at St. Joseph Catholic Church, conducting masses every Sunday, hearing confessions, working with the youth of the parish, participating in community events. And the Wetterlings were left to wonder if the man who might know what happened to their son was hiding behind a clerical collar, protected by the institutional power of the church. The situation remained unchanged until 1996. 2 years later, when Jerry and Patty learned that Father Damien Barker was once again preparing to be transferred. This time he was being moved to a new position within the Diocese of St. Cloud, a promotion of sorts, a new assignment in a new community where he would have even more responsibility and influence. The news that Father Barker might leave the St. Joseph area without ever being properly questioned, without ever being investigated, without ever being ruled out as a suspect, reignited Jerry Wetterling's fierce determination. He could not let this happen. He could not allow a potential suspect, someone with a documented history of allegations involving young boys, to simply walk away without being examined. Jerry approached Chief Hargrove a second time, pleading with him to investigate Father Barker before the transfer took place. Once the priest moved to his new assignment, it would become even more difficult to pursue any questions about his possible involvement. This was the moment to act, Jerry argued passionately. This was the time to get answers, to at least ask the questions that needed to be asked. But the response from Chief Hargrove remained exactly the same, as frustrating and dismissive as before. There was no evidence to justify an inquiry. The matter was closed. The police would not be investigating a priest based on rumors and suspicions. Frustrated beyond measure, angry at the stonewalling, but absolutely refusing to give up, Jerry Wetterling decided to take a different approach. If the official channels were closed to him, if law enforcement wouldn't act even when presented with credible concerns, then he would turn to the power of the community itself. Jerry began reaching out to friends and neighbors throughout St. Joseph. He shared his concerns about Father Barker's background, explaining what Evangeline had told Patty. He talked about the timing of the priest's arrival, just 6 months before Jacob disappeared. He asked for people's support in demanding that authorities at least look into the matter, at least ask some questions, at least rule Father Barker out as a potential suspect, if nothing else. Jerry's persistence and passion resonated deeply with the townspeople of St. Joseph. These were people who had known the Wetterling family for years, who had watched their children grow up, who had been part of the massive searches in the days and weeks after Jacob's disappearance. They trusted Jerry and Patty. They believed in their cause. They wanted answers just as desperately as the family did. Eventually, through determination and tireless effort, Jerry gathered more than 1,000 signatures from local residents who wanted the matter investigated. 1,000 people in a town of only 2,500 total residents, signing their names to a petition demanding action. It was a remarkable showing of community support, a powerful statement that could not be easily ignored. Jerry submitted the formal petition to the Stearns County Sheriff's Office. The document was carefully worded by people who understood they were walking a fine line. It did not explicitly accuse Father Damien Barker of abducting Jacob Wetterling. It did not claim to have proof of his involvement. Instead, it formally requested that investigators review any possible connection the priest might have had to the case on the night of Jacob's disappearance. It asked for due diligence, for a thorough investigation, for the same scrutiny that any other potential suspect would receive. After a month of consideration, after reviewing the petition and weighing the political and social implications, and under the considerable pressure of 1,000 local voices demanding action, the Stearns County Sheriff's Office finally made the decision to open an official investigation into Father Damien Barker. Detective Paul McCarthy was assigned to lead the investigation into the priest. It was a sensitive assignment, one that would require careful handling, given the subject's position in the community and the power of the institution backing him. One of Detective McCarthy's first actions was to submit a formal request to the Morrison County Sheriff's Office for any records related to the alleged sexual abuse incident involving the 13-year-old boy in Little Falls. If such a report existed, it would provide crucial context and potentially establish a pattern of behavior that would support the investigation. The response Detective McCarthy received was both unexpected and deeply troubling. Morrison County Sheriff's Office informed him that there was no record of such a case ever having existed in their files. No police report, no investigation file, no documentation whatsoever of any complaint against Father Barker. It was as if the incident Evangeline had described, the incident that had supposedly been reported to police by the victim's family, had never happened officially. The report had simply vanished, if it had ever been filed in the first place, likely handled entirely through church channels and kept away from official law enforcement records to protect the church's reputation. Despite this concerning lack of official documentation, Detective McCarthy proceeded with his investigation of Father Barker. The priest was formally summoned for questioning at the sheriff's office. During his interview with Detective McCarthy, Father Barker was asked directly about his whereabouts on the night of October 22nd, 1989, the night Jacob Wetterling disappeared. It was the central question, the alibi that would either clear him or make him a viable suspect. Father Barker stated clearly and without apparent hesitation that on that particular evening he had remained at St. Joseph Catholic Church for the entire night. He had not left the church property. He had been in his residence on the church grounds from early evening through the rest of the night and into the morning. He was alone, as he often was, spending the evening in prayer and reflection. Detective McCarthy thanked him for this information and then began the arduous process of attempting to verify the priest's alibi. He reached out to other church staff members, to parishioners who might have been at the church that evening, to anyone who might have seen Father Barker and could confirm his presence at the church during the crucial hours. But McCarthy found that no one was able to corroborate Father Barker's claim. No one had seen him that evening. No one could confirm that he had been at the church. Father Barker had been alone in his residence during the crucial hours when Jacob was abducted, with no witnesses to verify his whereabouts. There was no alibi, just his word against the suspicions. Detective McCarthy then made a request that he hoped would help clarify the situation and either clear Father Barker or provide grounds for further investigation. He asked Father Barker to voluntarily submit to a polygraph examination, commonly known as a lie detector test. Father Barker eventually agreed to take the polygraph, though he was clearly not enthusiastic about it. The examination was scheduled and conducted by a trained polygraph examiner, following standard protocols. The results came back indicating deception. Father Damien Barker had failed the polygraph examination on questions related to Jacob's disappearance. When Detective McCarthy confronted the priest with these troubling results, Father Barker had an explanation ready. He explained the failure by claiming that the events of 1989 were simply too far in the past now, 7 years removed. His memory of that specific night, one night among thousands of nights of his ministry, was unclear and hazy. He suggested that this uncertainty, this inability to remember with perfect clarity, had caused him physiological stress during the polygraph examination, which in turn had produced the indicators of deception. It was a reasonable-sounding explanation on the surface, and without physical evidence or a confession, without any concrete proof linking Father Barker to Jacob's disappearance or to the gravel driveway that night, the sheriff's office had no legal grounds to hold him or charge him with anything. Father Damien Barker was released and allowed to return to his duties. But Detective McCarthy wasn't finished pursuing this angle. In a further attempt to find some kind of clarity or breakthrough that might crack the case open, he decided to try something that might jog the memory of one of the key witnesses to the abduction. McCarthy obtained an audio recording of Father Barker's voice from one of his church sermons, capturing the priest's normal speaking voice in a natural context. He then arranged to play this recording for Trevor Wetterling, who was now 16 years old, nearly 7 years removed from that terrible night when a masked man with a raspy voice took his brother. McCarthy watched the teenager closely as the recording played, hoping desperately for a definitive reaction that would break the case wide open, that would give them the connection they needed. He played the recording multiple times, asking Trevor to listen carefully to the tone, the pitch, the timbre, the quality of Father Barker's voice, to try to match it against his memory of that night. After listening several times, concentrating hard on the memory of that raspy voice from the gravel driveway all those years ago, Trevor told Detective McCarthy that Father Barker's voice sounded very similar to the voice of the man who had stopped them on the road. The vocal quality was similar. The tone was reminiscent. There were resemblances that couldn't be ignored. However, and this was crucial, the weight of the moment and the passage of so much time meant that Trevor could not be absolutely, completely certain. He couldn't swear under oath in a court of law that Father Barker was definitely the man. The similarity was there, the resemblance was real, but certainty was not. 7 years was a long time, and the man had been wearing a mask, and it had been dark, and Trevor had been terrified. This inconclusive voice identification only served to deepen the investigators' suspicions about the priest, while simultaneously leaving them frustrated that they couldn't prove anything definitively. They had a failed polygraph and a tentative voice identification from a traumatized witness years after the fact, but that wasn't nearly enough for charges, much less a conviction in court. At the time this investigation was taking place, Father Damien Barker was widely respected within St. Joseph. He was seen as a pillar of the community, a spiritual leader who had served faithfully, second in importance and influence only to the senior priest, Father Hans Olsen. Consequently, the investigation into Father Barker provoked an intense and bitter backlash from a significant segment of the local Catholic community who refused to believe their priest could be involved in such evil. Supporters of Father Barker, people who had known him for years and trusted him implicitly, began calling for the social isolation of the Wetterling family. Jerry and Patty found themselves facing hostility and anger from people they had considered friends and neighbors. Some people stopped talking to them at church and in town. Some people crossed the street to avoid them. Anonymous letters arrived criticizing them for persecuting a man of God. Most shockingly and painfully, a counter-petition was actually submitted to the Bishop of the Diocese of St. Cloud. This petition, signed by dozens of defenders of Father Barker, demanded that the bishop take strong action against Jerry and Patty Wetterling. Specifically, it demanded that the bishop impose excommunication on Jerry and Patty for what the signers described as a serious act of sacrilege against a servant of the church, for daring to suggest that a priest could be involved in such a crime. Despite immense pressure, Jerry and Patty refused to back down. Their son was more important than their social standing. In the midst of this tension, Father Hans Olsen wrote a formal letter vouching for Father Barker's character in the strongest possible terms. With the church hierarchy behind him and no direct evidence, the investigation stalled completely. The files on Father Damien Barker were put away. Father Barker completed his transfer and moved on. The Wetterlings remained, still searching, still hoping. The trajectory of the Jacob Wetterling investigation shifted dramatically in 2004, 15 years after Jacob's disappearance, when John Sanner was elected as the Stearns County Sheriff. Sheriff Sanner made a very public vow during his campaign and after taking office that he would exhaust every available resource to solve the Wetterling case. It was a promise that resonated deeply with the community and gave the Wetterlings renewed hope. Sanner and his team began to thoroughly re-evaluate all the evidence. One of the most significant shifts involved the vehicle. For 14 years, investigators had assumed the perpetrator used a car or truck. But Sheriff Sanner's team developed a new theory. The abduction had been carried out entirely on foot. This shift was enormous because it suggested the perpetrator lived very close to where Jacob was taken. The investigation turned its focus to Dan Rassier, the elementary school music teacher who lived at the end of that gravel driveway. This change was driven by the belated account of a man named Kevin. On the night of the abduction in 1989, Kevin and his girlfriend had been listening to a police scanner. Hearing about the missing boy, they drove to the area, turned down the gravel driveway and spotted the bicycles in the ditch. Kevin had told this story at parties for years. In 2003, he told it to a federal marshal who urged him to provide a formal statement. To Sheriff Sanner's team, Kevin's story explained the vehicle Dan had seen and the tire tracks. The abductor hadn't used a vehicle at all. For the next several years, investigators focused on building a case against Dan Rassier. On June 30th, 2010, a massive task force descended on Dan's property. The search lasted 2 days and became a major media event. Helicopters broadcast images of investigators excavating his property, digging through the ash pile where his family had dumped ashes from their wood-burning stove for years. The public search destroyed Dan Rassier's life. His face was broadcast nationwide as the primary suspect. For the next 15 years, he lived under a cloud of suspicion and hostility. Dan was an elementary school music teacher who lived with his elderly parents. Throughout the ordeal, he maintained his complete innocence, insisting repeatedly that he had nothing to do with Jacob's disappearance. For years, the investigation stayed fixed on Dan Rassier, but the answer had already surfaced years earlier in a separate case. Jared Scheil. Jared Scheil was 12 years old on January 13th, 1989, just 9 months before Jacob vanished. He lived in Cold Spring, a short distance from St. Joseph. On that evening, Jared had been ice skating with friends. Afterward, he and a friend began walking home, but reached a point where they had to part ways. As Jared walked alone, a vehicle pulled up beside him. The driver asked for directions. When Jared approached to help, the man exited and informed Jared he had a weapon. He ordered Jared into the vehicle. Jared climbed into the back seat and was told to lie face down with a hat over his head, blocking his vision. As they drove, Jared heard a police scanner crackling in the front, the same distinctive sound. He tried tracking their route, feeling them cross train tracks, but eventually became completely disoriented. The vehicle stopped on a remote gravel road. The man sexually assaulted Jared in that vehicle, then drove him back toward Cold Spring, dropping him off about 2 minutes from home. Before Jared exited, the man delivered a chilling warning: run away and don't look back. He added that if anyone came looking for him, if anyone found out who he was, he would find Jared and kill him. The exact same threats given to Trevor and Aaron months later. The assault was reported to police and evidence collected, including the clothing Jared had been wearing. But the case went cold, filed away, unsolved. Years later, after moving to Painesville, Jared began hearing about similar assaults there involving young boys. He started making connections, wondering if his assault, Jacob's disappearance, and the Painesville crimes were all the work of the same person. Jared sought out the other victims, and together they contacted investigators on the Wetterling case. This led investigators to re-examine physical evidence. Law enforcement still possessed Jared's clothing from 1989, carefully preserved in evidence storage. With advanced DNA technology now available, they extracted a profile from the perpetrator's biological material found on the clothing. Buried in the Wetterling case files was a name that had appeared very early: Danny Heinrich, questioned and released in the first days of the investigation. Investigators obtained Heinrich's DNA sample and compared it to the profile from Jared's clothing. Perfect match. Danny Heinrich was definitively the man who assaulted Jared Scheil. At the time, Heinrich was a 53-year-old single man residing in Annandale, Minnesota. He'd lived quietly for decades, drawing little attention. What was absolutely infuriating, Heinrich had been the very first suspect questioned in 1989. He'd been cooperative, providing hair samples, shoes for comparison, allowing his tires to be examined. Investigators had noted his shoes and tires matched the evidence found at the scene, but concluded it wasn't definitive enough to charge him. They'd obtained a search warrant for his father's house where Heinrich was living. They found black boots, clothing items, police scanners, and locked trunks containing photographs of young boys in their underwear and towels. Heinrich insisted the images were innocent. In a decision later viewed with intense criticism, investigators let him keep the photographs. He later burned them. Lacking sufficient evidence, they released Heinrich. He disappeared back into ordinary life for 26 years. However, despite DNA proof of his guilt in the Jaredshire assault, the statute of limitations for that crime had expired. Heinrich could not be charged for it, but the DNA match provided grounds for a new search warrant for Heinrich's current residence. On July 28, 2015, investigators descended on Heinrich's home in Annandale. Inside, they found disturbing evidence: duct tape and handcuffs in a kitchen drawer, 4 large containers filled with boys' clothing in various sizes, numerous videotapes Heinrich had recorded over more than a decade containing footage of young boys filmed without their knowledge, 19 binders carefully organized and filled with child pornography images. Based on this evidence, Heinrich was arrested and charged with 25 federal counts related to possession and receipt of child pornography. Heinrich spent nearly a year in jail awaiting trial. 3 weeks before trial, his attorneys proposed a plea deal. If he confessed to Jacob's abduction and murder and led authorities to the remains, he would plead guilty to a single count carrying a maximum of 20 years. For Patty and Jerry, after 27 years of not knowing, the need for answers and to bring their son home outweighed the desire for a longer sentence. They agreed to the arrangement. Danny Heinrich's confession was delivered in a cold, methodical, emotionless tone that made it all the more chilling. On October 22nd, 1989, he'd been driving around St. Joseph. He turned down the road to the Wetterling house and decided to wait for the boys to return from town. He parked near the gravel driveway where he wouldn't be immediately visible and waited in the darkness. Eventually, he saw 3 boys on bicycles riding home, one wearing a reflective vest that made them easy to spot, carrying a flashlight. Heinrich exited his vehicle and walked toward the road, positioning himself to intercept them. Everything happened exactly as Trevor and Aaron had described years ago. Heinrich confronted the 3 boys, announced he had a weapon, ordered them off their bikes and into the ditch. He asked their ages. Trevor was 10. Heinrich told him to run and not look back. Aaron was 11. Heinrich told him the same after inappropriately touching Jacob. Jacob was also 11. Heinrich made a different choice. He handcuffed Jacob's hands behind his back and led him to his vehicle. He placed the 11-year-old boy in the front passenger seat and drove away. As they drove, Jacob was crying, asking over and over what he had done wrong. What crime had he committed? Why was this happening to him? Heinrich monitored his police scanner, hearing increased radio activity indicating the search was mobilizing. He commanded Jacob to stay low in the seat so they wouldn't be spotted by patrol cars. He drove around St. Joseph, then headed toward Painesville where he lived, approximately 25 to 30 miles away. He pulled off onto a side road near a gravel pit, a remote location far from witnesses. He ordered Jacob to exit the vehicle. He removed the handcuffs. Then he ordered the boy to undress. In the terrible isolation of that gravel pit, Heinrich sexually assaulted Jacob Wetterling. Afterward, Jacob began crying, shivering in the cold, October night air. He told Heinrich he was cold and wanted to go home. He wanted his mum and dad. He wanted to be safe. Heinrich told him to get dressed, to put his clothes back on. As Jacob was dressing with shaking hands, struggling to button his red jacket, a patrol car happened to drive by on a nearby road. The officers weren't searching that specific area at that moment, just covering ground as part of the general search effort. But the sight of police lights caused Heinrich to panic. He became convinced authorities were closing in. He told Jacob to turn around, to face away from him. Then Heinrich raised his gun and attempted to shoot 11-year-old Jacob in the back of the head. The gun jammed. It didn't fire. Jacob stood there frozen in absolute terror, having heard the click of the trigger, knowing what was about to happen. Heinrich cleared the jam, racked the slide to chamber a new round, and fired a second time. The gun fired. The bullet struck Jacob in the back of the head. The boy fell to the ground. Jacob Wetterling died there on that dark road, died asking what he'd done wrong, died cold and terrified and crying for his parents who couldn't save him. Heinrich left Jacob's body where it fell. He drove home, but he returned a few hours later in the early morning with a shovel. Unable to dig deep enough by hand, he walked to a nearby construction site and took a bobcat loader. He used the heavy machinery to dig a grave, then buried Jacob. He returned the bobcat to where he'd found it. Before leaving, Heinrich realized he'd forgotten to bury Jacob's shoes. He picked them up and threw them into a nearby ravine. About a year later, Heinrich returned to the site and decided to move the remains. He transported them to a nearby cow pasture and buried them in a hole approximately 2 feet deep. There, Jacob stayed for 26 years while investigators searched everywhere else. When Heinrich led investigators to the location in September 2016, they'd come prepared with metal detectors to find the metal buttons on Jacob's jacket. But they didn't need technology. As they approached the area, Heinrich indicated they saw something that stopped them. A small, weathered piece of red fabric sticking out of the ground. Partially exposed to decades of Minnesota weather, faded but still recognizable as fabric from a jacket. For 27 years, that fragment of Jacob's red jacket had been there, while investigators followed 70,000 leads, excavated Dan Rassier's property, investigated Father Barker, and searched everywhere except the one place where Jacob actually was. The recovery operation began. Jacob Wetterling's remains were carefully excavated and returned to his family. The recovery dismantled the hope Patty and Jerry had maintained for 10,000 days. The birthday cupcake ritual was over. The porch light was extinguished. They were forced to reconcile the sweet boy they remembered with the terrible knowledge of how his life ended, that his last words were asking what he'd done wrong. The legal resolution brought its own frustration. Heinrich received 20 years in federal prison for the child pornography charges. To many, it seemed grossly inadequate for ending a child's life. But this legal reality validated the work Patty had already begun years earlier. Refusing to let her son be remembered only as a victim, she transformed her grief into formidable political action. During the decades Jacob was missing, Patty lobbied tirelessly in Washington, D.C. She met with legislators, testified before committees, told Jacob's story again and again. Her efforts led to landmark federal legislation signed by President Bill Clinton on October 12, 1994, less than 5 years after Jacob's disappearance. The Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act was the first of its kind in American history, fundamentally changing how the nation approached the problem of predators who target children. This groundbreaking law required all 50 states to establish registries for individuals convicted of certain crimes against children and other sexually violent offenses. For the first time, there would be a systematic, nationwide tracking system. Before Jacob's law, predators could commit a crime in one state, serve their sentence, then simply move across state lines to a new community where no one knew about their past. They could live next door to schools and playgrounds, and the community would have no way of knowing the danger in their midst. Jacob's law ended that anonymity. It established that public safety outweighed offender privacy. The law paved the way for Megan's Law in 1996, which required states not just to maintain registries but to make that information publicly available. Community notification became mandatory. Parents gained the legal right to know if a registered offender lived nearby. Together, these laws fundamentally shifted the balance from offender privacy to community safety. Today, every state maintains registries. Parents can access these databases with a few clicks. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of children have been potentially protected by these laws over the past 3 decades. All of this exists because Patty Wetterling refused to let her son's disappearance be in vain. She turned grief into action, loss into legislation, personal nightmare into national protection. In an interview following Jacob's funeral, Patty spoke through tears. "My little boy is finally home. I'm deeply grateful for the dedication and persistence of law enforcement who never gave up on Jacob." She also expressed regret toward those hurt by the investigation, particularly Dan Rassier, whose life had been destroyed despite his innocence. The conclusion of the case permanently altered the landscape of childhood in America, changing how parents think about safety, how communities monitor threats, how law enforcement tracks individuals who pose risks to children. But for St. Joseph, the legacy remained a permanent loss of innocence. The town would never again be the place where the police chief didn't carry a weapon, where parents felt comfortable letting children ride bikes at night, without worry. That sense of absolute safety had died on October 22, 1989. As investigators stood over the burial site, one fact stood out above all others. They'd spent nearly 3 decades following 70,000 leads, deploying every resource available: helicopters, bloodhounds, all-terrain vehicles, horses, metal detectors, search parties numbering in the thousands. They'd investigated hundreds of suspects, excavated properties, conducted thousands of interviews, pursued every angle and theory. They'd looked everywhere, searched everywhere, considered everyone. And yet, throughout all those years, all those searches, all that effort, a small weathered fragment of Jacob's red jacket had been resting in that cow pasture, essentially in plain sight, just 2 feet below the surface, in a field where cattle grazed, where farmers worked, where life went on. For 27 years that piece of red fabric had been there, and for 27 years nobody had found him. Thank you for watching this investigation on Crime Records. The Jacob Wetterling case is one of the most significant in American history, not just because of the tragedy itself, but because of what came from it. Please take a moment to hit that like button if this investigation moved you or taught you something important. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case, on the laws it created, on how it affected you personally. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these critical stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe to Crime Records and turn on your notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the cases that changed history, the investigations that shaped our laws, and the stories that remind us why justice matters. Jacob Wetterling's legacy lives on in every registry check a parent runs before choosing a neighborhood, in every community notification that warns of potential danger, in every child potentially protected because information is available that wasn't available before 1994. His story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, we have the power to create meaningful change. We have the ability to ensure that loss is not meaningless, that pain can produce protection, that one family's nightmare can prevent countless others. Stay safe, protect your loved ones, and we'll see you in the next investigation. This has been Crime Records.